every patient that comes to us for psychoanalytical help is suffering, and the structure of all of their suffering can be generalized like this, that there's something which they can't manage, something they can't cope with. It can be a great variety of things, but there's something that they can't manage in their lives, which they've tried to exclude from the equation of how they live their lives. They've tried to get rid of it, put it out of mind, which in the old terminology means, rendering it unconscious, excluding it from the system consciousness. But let's forget the old terminology and come back to what it really means, which is that there's something that the patient can't cope with, and they exclude it from the mental sphere, from the way that the things they take account of when they try to live their lives. The symptoms come from the fact that that doesn't work, and the thing that they've tried to exclude comes back. The coming back of what can't be coped with is what causes the symptoms. It's an extremely useful formulation. So that's why I'm starting out now by reminding you of that yet again. Try something you can't cope with, you exclude it as if it weren't there, and only because it doesn't succeed, the exclusion, you have symptoms, which is the coming back of the thing you can't cope with. Then you've got a symptom that you can't cope with. And that sends you to seek professional help. Now, I'm using that kind of terminology because I'm about to go into theory. So I'm wanting to use as colloquial a sort of way of putting it as possible, in order for us to not glaze over and think theory. I am now going to go into deep theory. I'm going to start out by reminding you that we have a basic model of the mind, which is the absolute essence of the psychoanalytical way of thinking, which is that the person is in conflict, that they're dealing with competing demands, that there are things that come at you from all sides that you have to deal with, and they're not dealing with themselves. You have to deal with them. So you have this dynamic struggle between, on the one hand, the things that you want and need, and the things that you can actually get in reality. And you are in between those two things. That's the critical, the fundamental psychodynamic model. That you, all of us, have competing for the mental work that we have to do, which is the living of our lives. We have this conflictual situation. On the one hand, there are things that we want and need, and on the other hand, there's what we can actually get out there in the world. Why it's so difficult is because the things that we want and need are out there in the world. And you are the one who has to balance these things. Find a way of meeting your wants and needs in your actual life in the world. You have to engage with the world because the things you want and need are out there. That's the crux of our model. Now I'm going to start moving into abstraction. And remember, please, what I've just said, because that's not much of an abstraction. It's not very technical. But that really is all that this is about. We are, by dint of being living creatures, faced with this dynamic struggle of trying to meet our needs, which come at us non-stop. We always want and need things. Those things never go away because we're living creatures, we have wants and needs, and then out there in the world is where we have to try and satisfy them, and the world's not there for us. The world's there for itself. The only difference between the only differentiation one needs to draw in regard to this world being there for itself is that there are some people, some objects as we call them, Some objects, we use the word to refer to the fact that it's not me, it's not the subject, it's an object, something out there in the world. Some of them, thank heavens, good Lord be praised, some of them care about us. And that starts with our parents all being well. That's why parents are so terribly important in psychoanalytical theory, and childhood is so terribly important, because that's when you're the most helpless. You're the most helpless at the beginning because you don't know the foggiest thing about how to meet your needs in the world. So thank God for parents who care about you. They are not indifferent to you. Why? Because they see you as a bit of themselves. And then that carries on in adult life, all being well. And this doesn't by any means go without saying, in the people who love us after our parents. So that's why our love life is so important. Finding people who care about you and who love you is terribly important, because the rest of the world doesn't give a shit about you and your wants and your needs. Now, this you that I'm talking about, we call it the ego in psychoanalysis. It's a slightly unfortunate fact that we call it the ego, because immediately, as I say, you glaze over. Now he's going to talk about egos and things. As a matter of fact, in the German, the word is me or I. So this sort of abstract language doesn't apply in the original Freudian texts. But for all sorts of reasons that have nothing to do with us today, in the English we speak about the ego. So now I'm going to draw on this piece of paper a map of a mind, which has got things called egos and whatnot. They're abstractions. Please remember, it's just a way of describing, of mapping us in our lives, in our struggle to meet our wants and needs in life. It's just a convenient shorthand. Before I go into drawing this convenient shorthand, I must say two things. The first is, I'm going to put it as simply as I can. Absolutely simply. I know you're all highly learned people, and I'm not demeaning you by doing this. I'm doing it because I believe that it is extremely complicated, and I want to rekindle in you your extremely simple understanding. Because in order for us to deal with all the complexities, this simple map is terribly, terribly helpful. It's like that little, what do you call those things in your car these days? Little simplified map of Cape Town telling you where to go. This is one of those things. GPS. The other thing I want to say before doing this very simple map is you're not going to recognize it entirely as the one that you learned at school, because I've changed it a little bit. I've changed it a little bit, firstly, in order to make it simpler, but not overly simple in the sense that I'm distorting it. If I may boast for a moment, for a good cause, I must remind you, I am the official translator of Freud's complete works. I understand Freud very, very well, better than anyone I know. So when I oversimplify it, please have confidence that you are learning it from an expert. And even if it looks different from what you learned at school, this is an expert talking. Simple as it might seem, it's correct. Okay, it's trustworthy. The last thing I must say is that it's slightly different from what you learned at school, because, as I said earlier in response to Adrian's question, there's some things which I think need to be said differently. So what I'm saying here is not 1900 or 1923, it's 2008. It's my product of my efforts over my increasingly long lifetime to make sense of it all. And I now give it to you with love and kisses. Here's the ego. That's us. Me. And in the case of your patients, them. But they're the same as us. Here are their needs and their wants. That we call the ego. This, forgive me, we call drives. Drives, or instincts in Strachey's translation, are things which became, actually it's changing again, but for a long time they were a very taboo subject, or sort of old-fashioned, fuddy-duddy, out-of-date conception in psychoanalysis. It's changing, thank heavens, but whether it's changed or it hasn't changed, the fact of the matter is they're there. We are biological creatures. We are animals. It's as obvious as anything that that's what we are. We were not made in God's image in 7 days, or however it worked, and plonked there to do good deeds. We evolved from mammals and primates into ourselves, and we are animals, which means we have biological urges and needs. And that's what in psychoanalysis we conceptualize under the heading of drives. In psychoanalysis, we and this applies to just about, but not every, but just about every school of psychoanalysis, speaks of there being broadly two types of drive. There are libidinal drives, or erotic drives, or life drives, and there are destructive drives, or death drives. As I said to you before the break, my original discipline is one of the neurosciences. And this happens to be an area, a case in point of what I said earlier, when I said that there's an enormous amount being learnt about the mind outside of psychoanalysis. And it should be no surprise to learn that this part of the mind, you're in a much better position to learn about it in neurobiology than you are in psychoanalysis. To divine through the thickets of the mind and experience of an individual human being lying on your couch what the fundamental drives are that motivate them as an instance of Homo sapiens, is much less likely to get to the full picture than simply doing experiments and saying, well, let me tweak this and see what it does to the animal's behavior. So there's been an enormous amount of progress in the neurosciences as regards these things. I'm not going to go into all of that because this is a seminar on technique. So I think for present purposes, it is actually sufficient to just stick with the generalization that there are destructive drives and there are loving drives. They are felt by the ego as hatred and desire, or something of that kind. Here's the objects. That's the world, reality. The drives are trying to be met in reality, because that's the only place that they can be. At birth, we don't have an ego. What is an ego? An ego is, as I said, it's an experiencing me, but it's more than just an experiencing me. It's a structure. It's a thing that grows. It's a thing that is the repository of your experience of being in the world. It's your autobiography, if you will. It's highly individualized. It is unique to you. It is the sort of sum of the representations of your experience of trying to meet your needs in the world, which is what your life boils down to. In the theoretical beginning, there is only an experiencing me. It hasn't yet got any memory. It hasn't yet got any knowledge. It hasn't yet built up any assumptions based in how the world actually works for you. At that theoretical fictive moment, we say there's no ego. Now, there's a little bit of controversy about this point in our theory, in different schools of our theory. For our purposes, it doesn't matter a hell of a lot. I'm quite happy to call it a theoretical fiction. That there's a point at which there's no me, and then me gets built. let's just say there's a very rudimentary me, and me gets built. It makes no difference. The main thing to understand is that the ego, the me, the individual, the personality, is shaped by learning what works and what doesn't work in terms of meeting your needs in the world. That's what it's there for. It's there to learn from experience. That's why we have memory. That's why we have representational systems, as they call it in metapsychology. It's to retain the benefits of past experience. In the beginning, in the theoretical beginning, before this thing has formed beyond just experiencing, before it's got any kind of structure, any shape based on a real knowledge of how you actually can meet your needs in the world, we speak of the drives being totally in charge. The drives. The destructive one, let's call this the destructive one, and this one the libidinal one. They, according to this theory, create a world. I want this thing, so I've got it. That's how we believe it works at the beginning. You picture what you want as being what's there. Now, of course, it doesn't work. And then comes the whole long, difficult process of getting your illusions to fit, or your delusions to fit in with how things really work. This is theory. We'll come back to reality later. This mode of functioning that I've just described, where you have delusions, where you say, I want, I need, therefore I have, this totally omnipotent creating of an hallucinatory, delusional world is psychosis. That's the essence of what psychosis is. So this is a psychotic level of functioning, where you create the world omnipotently. Then you start to develop an ego. The ego, at this primitive stage of development, in the earliest months and years of life, is feeble, is ignorant, is not yet accurately portraying how your needs really get met in the world. It's an evolution from that psychotic level of functioning where you just delude yourself that you've made it like you want it to be, only to find it doesn't work. When you start finding it doesn't work, you start building up a sense of how the world actually functions. And because the ego is still so immature at that point, because this structure is still so weak relative to the great power of the drives which stay as powerful from the minute you're born until the minute you die. These very powerful drives are much stronger than the ego at that point. And remember, I said you experience your drives as emotions, as feelings, broadly speaking, loving feelings and hating feelings. So the primitive ego is dominated by feelings. Hating feelings, I don't want that. I hate that. I want to get rid of that. Which is driven by these drives. Aggressive, destructive forces. Which are there for a good reason. I'll just quickly say for a moment, going back to neurobiology, it's there for a very good reason. There are things in the world which do want to do you harm. You know, you need to have forces, you need to have inbuilt capacities to deal with them. The basic principle is aversion. Get it away. Withdraw from that. If it comes back, kill it. You know, it's a matter of life and death. There are things that want to destroy you. It's life or death. It's you or them. So these forces are there for a reason. Destructive forces. And they start building up hateful feelings toward the world. And so you start representing the world, pictures of the world, which you hate. Bad things. we call them bad objects, which we've internalized. In the Kleinian terminology, they're bad objects. Likewise, we build up good objects, things that satisfy us. Again, I hardly need to tell you, from a biological perspective, it has to be so. You have to learn which things actually meet your needs. And what do? You feel attracted to them. You wish to be with them. You wish to incorporate them. You wish to unite with them. These are the things that are life-giving and life-preserving. These are the things which are anti-life, which you have to destroy if you're not to be destroyed yourself. That we call good objects, this we call bad objects. At this level of functioning, dominated by your emotions, dominated by these drives, which have no relationship to each other. These drives are absolutely independent forces coming from a mindless id, we call this, in contradistinction to the ego, the me. There's the it. The id is it. It's not me. It's a thing. It's a biological thing, which just drives through you. These powerful emotions. In the ego, you build up pictures of those things which are good, which satisfy your libidinal or loving or wanting or needing drives, and you build up a picture of taking them into yourself. Quite separately from those, you build up a picture, and it's good that they're separate. This is an absolutely important distinction. Which things are good? Those are the ones I approach. Which are the things that are bad? Those are the things I avoid. Those are the things I seek to get away from me. These are the things I seek to take into me. It is absolutely adaptive to speak again as a neurobiologist that there should be such a thing. It's the most important distinction that you can ever make. What's good and what's bad? What's going to meet my needs and what's going to destroy me? What do I want to take into me and what do I want to get as far away from as I possibly can? So we speak at this stage of development, because of that powerfully adaptive need to distinguish what's good from what's bad, we speak of splitting. It's a splitting of the world. It's a classification of the world according to how it makes you feel and how you feel about it. We call it splitting. And because what's good we're attracted to and seek to have close to us and you combine and unite with, we speak of introjection in regard to good objects. And mutatis mutandis, because in the case of these objects, we want to get rid of them or get as far away from them as we possibly can, we speak of projection. Those things I want away. These things I want here. Splitting, therefore, goes together with, hand in hand with, introjection and projection. They're the same thing. They're just different aspects of the same thing. That level of functioning, I've told you we call psychotic. This level of functioning that I've just described to you, we call narcissistic. I've just described the stage, this was called the stage of hallucinatory wish fulfillment in Freud. This is the stage of primary narcissism in Freud. Psychotic, narcissistic. In Kohut, Klein, I've told you, speaks of bad and good objects in this split narcissistic ego. Kohut speaks of self-objects, and that's a very important term, very valuable term, because it helps to remind us that these objects are in fact inside the ego. They're parts of the self, But some of those parts we are trying to relegate to the outside world, like bad feelings, like burps and farts and hunger and wet nappies, burning rashes, all these bad feelings. We're trying to get rid of them, trying to get away from them, which means trying to exclude them from the sphere of me. Conversely here, this horrible feeling that you're trying to get rid of, called hunger, can be replaced by this wonderful thing called the breast, which you then take into yourself. You feel, this is the thing I want. This is what I'm going to take into me through my mouth or through whatever. Usually the mouth is the easiest way to get things into you, especially when you're a little neonate. It's basically the only thing that works is the mouth. So introjection and projection is absolutely fundamental to this narcissistic mode of operation. But the feelings like hunger actually are part of you. So you turn it, you experience it as a bad thing, which you want to push out into the world and turn into an object. That doesn't mean it really is an object. So you experience the world at that point as a hateful thing, a bad thing, causing you bad feelings. That's why you're getting rid of it. That's why you're projecting it out into the world. But in reality, from the point of view of the third-person observer, the adult, us, we look at that and we say, that is inside the baby. It's a bad object in the baby. The baby experiences it as a bad object. It's out there, but it's actually a part of itself, which is why the term self-object is so valuable. The term is more easy to see. It's more easy to see the value of the term with regard to the good objects. There's the breast. I want it inside of me. Even though it's an object, I experience it as part of myself. I want to take it into myself. It's an ideal thing. It's a wonderful thing. I want to be united with it. I want to have it on demand. It's one step away from omnipotent hallucination. You know, I want it on demand, so I create the illusion of it being there, which doesn't work. This one here, I want it on demand, so I take it into me so that I can have it under my control when I need it. I'll make it part of my omnipotent sphere of myself. It's a self-object, which I experience as part of myself, and this is a self-object which I experience as part not of myself. That's my aim in relation to these objects. That's the essence of narcissism. Now, I've said that Klein speaks of bad objects and good objects. Bad objects and good objects, I hardly need to say, are absolutely bad and absolutely good. That's in the nature of splitting. It's in the essence of splitting. And as I told you, it's there for good reason. There should be no ambiguity about what's good and what's bad. Klein also spoke of this as the primitive superego. That is to say, the part of your own self that is in fact hateful and felt to be an object, something out there in the world. It's fundamental to these objects that you're trying to get them out there in the world for the reasons I've already told you and won't repeat. But it is a sad fact that it's actually inside of you. There are bad things that you feel that are part of life that you can't get rid of. They're inside of you. And I speak here of nappy rashes and hungers and burps and farts, but it carries on, as we all know, to our great sadness and distress. Bad things just get more and more. They're there. And bad things about ourselves that we gradually discover. Shit, look at me, I've got big ears, you know, now I've learned that. What am I going to do about that? Oh, the other boys tease me, you know. All these things, you don't want them to be there, but they're there. All of those things you try to get rid of, but you can't. This is why Klein calls this the primitive superego. This, what I'm going to say to you now. It's because it's a part of your own ego which is experienced as not me. It's something which is bad. It's something which is hateful. It's something which is alien. and experienced as not on my side, and fundamentally not of me. And yet, sorry, it is in you. She calls that the primitive superego. Freud didn't call it the primitive superego. Freud called it nothing, amazingly. There is no concept in Freud for this thing. Although if you read the paper on negation, you'll see that he knew it was there. But he had no term for it. Why? Well, for a hell of a lot of reasons. Not least of them that Freud mainly focused on this drive. Klein mainly focused on that one. Why did she mainly focus on that one? Because that was the one that was left. This thing, Freud had a name for. He called it the pleasure ego. He also called it, in a slightly different context, the ego ideal. The ego ideal, the repository of your narcissism, the perfect version of yourself, the thing that you really, truly wish you could be. Only that. This level of functioning, this narcissistic level of functioning, is covered partially, therefore, by Freud's concept of the superego. This is the primitive superego, Klein's version of what is going to become the superego. And this is the ego ideal, which is also part of the superego in Freudian theory. But neither of these concepts is properly resolved in Freud. Bring me the analyst who can explain to me how the concept of an ego ideal fits properly with the concept of a superego, and I'll show you 55 contradictions. This simple formulation that I'm giving you here resolves those contradictions. This level of the mind is narcissism. It's part of what we're going to think of, what Freud is going to call the superego. I'll make it clearer in a moment. The world doesn't really work like this, as we all know. There are parts of ourselves, as I said, our big ears or our small willies, or the fact that we can't compete with the main manner that count at school, or the fact that our fathers are so big and strong and we feel like puny little 90-pound weaklings, and after our fathers, then there are others too, who make us feel small and bad. These things exist. Although at the level of the narcissistic ego, the baby ego, primary narcissism ego, which is better than psychosis, it acknowledges these things exist, but it pushes them away into the object. It isn't really like that. Therefore, it can't work, because they're not in the object. They're in you. They're bad feelings attached to you, really. Bad things about yourself and your life and your experience of yourself which make you feel bad. They're there, like it or not. Mutatis mutandis for this one. There are things out there in the world which bring you every joy and happiness known to man. Problem is, they're out there in the world. And it doesn't mean that they're going to bring that joy and happiness to you. You try to bring it into your world, into your life, into your experience of yourself. You try to make it something constantly available to you, like your hands and your feet are. Something that's me is the only thing, or at least you've got the best chance of being able to count on it. If it's yours and it's you, you can call on it on demand. But it doesn't really work like that. Actually, objects are out there in the world, the good ones. The good ones that you want and need and depend on and desire. So this level of ego functioning has to be replaced by a more realistic level of ego functioning, which our pen is running out, is up there. Freud calls this the reality ego. He also calls it the ego. This is the crowning achievement of development. It's called the reality ego because it represents the world as it actually is, with all of its frustrations and disappointments, all of your own lacks and deficiencies. As much as you don't want it to be so, it is so. The reality ego learns to come to terms with how things actually work. It is, in a word, emotional maturity. This is emotional immaturity. It's how you want things to be. And it revolves fundamentally about what is me and what's not me. Trying to make not me all the things that you don't want, and trying to make me all the things that you do want on an illusory basis. So much so that there are self-objects here. They're parts of the object that are in fact parts of yourself as you experience them. They're an object, but they're really part of yourself. And these, they're really part of the object, but you experience them as part of yourself. That's how you wish it was. That has to be replaced by how it actually is. Their splitting gets replaced by whole object relationships. What Freud calls object love, which is where you recognize the thing I love is an object. The thing I love is separate from me. I love her even though I can't have her on demand. Even though she frustrates, disappoints, abandons, jilts me. When it happens, the reality ego, in its emotional maturity, feels sad. It mourns the loss. It recognizes its vulnerabilities and its dependencies. In lieu of those feelings, which are absolutely inescapable in the face of how the world really works, objects, in all of their capriciousness, disappointment, sadness, vulnerability, dependency. In recognition of those feelings, Melanie Klein called this level of functioning the depressive position. It's bloody sad. It's depressing the way the world works. And coming to terms with that is maturity, it's health. Then there are different things that you can do, and they come in 3 forms. And here are 3 forms of psychopathology. When I say to the extent that you can't cope, it's nothing to hold against ourselves. It's bloody difficult. Life's difficult. Because, as I said, you have these absolutely boundless needs and very strong feelings of love and hate. And they have to be directed toward objects in the world. And the objects in the world hate you too. They hate you back. And the ones that you love don't necessarily love you back. It's a bloody hard task to make it work. It requires mental work. That's what maturation is. That's what health is. Doing the bloody hard work of coping with the world as it is. Which includes coping with all the things about it that you don't want and all the things about yourself that you don't want. Why do we do it? It's because sometimes we do get what we want. And that's integrated into it too. And I realize there's a critically important detail I've slightly skimmed over, which I'll quickly elaborate on before I come back to the point that I'm at now, about how hard the ego's task is. I spoke of the paranoid schizoid position and the depressive position, and I spoke of the splitting here and the whole object relationships here. What I should have made more explicit, fundamental to Kleinian theory, is that as this develops, as a sense of reality evolves and matures, so you come to recognize that not only sometimes, but frequently, the things that you love are the same things as the things that you hate. The mother who frustrates you is the same mother that you adore. The father who threatens you is the same father that you admire. The same father that you want to be like, in the case of the typical case of the boy. So you have to come to terms with your ambivalence toward your objects. When you recognize that your object is both good and bad. And come to terms with that limitation. There's no ideal love, except in Mills and Boon, which is at the level of narcissistic fantasy. In reality, it's all a little bit more messy than that. And ambivalence needs to be tolerated. It's not nice that the objects that you love are also constantly bloody well annoying you. They're not under your omnipotent control. They're not there for you only. Thank heavens for parents, and thank heavens for love partners. They're there for you more than the rest of the bloody rabble. But they're not there only for you. They're there first and foremost for themselves. And that's insulting and frustrating and difficult to come to grips with, but come to grips with it you must. So to return to the main theme, that ego's task is very difficult. You can see why. You can see how. Therefore, it's not something to hold against it that it sometimes fails in its tasks, especially in childhood. Why especially in childhood? Because, as I've said already, that's when you have the least resources, the least ego resources, because an ego is something that evolves, it learns from experience. If you're confronted by some hugely difficult mental task in earliest childhood, if this conflictual situation that I've described, and as you can see, there are many of them, then there come times that you just can't cope. And it happens a hell of a lot more then. It's much more likely to happen then than it is to happen now. It can happen now. There are awfully traumatic things that happen to us in life. And in fact, the older we get, we start to become more subject to those things again. But the formative sacrifices that the ego has to make in order to be able to get by are in the earliest years of life, which is why childhood is so important. It's not because Freud said, I know what, let's make a theory that childhood is important. It's kind of like obvious. It has to be important. And your parents, therefore, the only ones who love you at that point, let's hope, and they don't love you perfectly, we know, they're important too, not because Freud thought it up. So, there are three main ways in which the ego gives up the ghost. The first and most common and happiest solution it can find is its drives, making all these demands, coming through its primitive layers in the form of strong wishes, strong wants, and strong dislikes, strong hates, coming at them, can't meet them in reality, and says, shit, I can't deal with this. I'm leaving that out. As long as I leave that out, I can deal with the rest. And that's called repression. Repression is sending a piece of ego back down. A strong desire connected to the world. That's what I want. But you can't, for the life of you, get it. And it keeps coming at you. That's what I want. And it keeps getting you into trouble. You can't cope with it. It's an impossible demand. You say, okay, I don't want it. You do actually. You always do actually. So it comes at a price. Because you do actually. And you pretend you don't. You've repressed it. Likewise with strong hates. You can repress strong hates too. you know. I want my father out of this picture. He causes me nothing but trouble. But Jesus is big. And shit, I don't know how to get rid of him. But I want to, you know. What am I going to do? I know what. I won't want it anymore. I'm giving that up. Out of the picture. I don't think like that anymore. It's repression. Big fat word. Very simple, very obvious, very kind of like predictable process. Repression comes at a price because you're excluding part of the facts. Those desires remain there, but now you can't meet them because you're saying they're not there. You have denuded yourself. Your life becomes restricted and limited. By degrees. The more you repress, the more limited you are. The more ill-equipped you are to deal with the world because you're leaving half the facts out. But at least you're still dealing with the world. If you didn't leave those facts out, it's worse. You're overwhelmed. You're absolutely overwhelmed. So it's better than that. You're only a little kid. Critically important. At that stage, you're only a little kid. You've got to exclude it. You can't cope with it. You're not in a position to make the world fit in with your wants and your needs, your loves and your hates. You can't do it. So, you know, why try? That is repression. That is not neurosis. It is only a neurosis when the repression fails. So because those wants are still there, those wants and needs are still there, banging on the door, what do? You build up defenses against them. No, I don't hate him. I love him. You know, I don't want to murder my brother. I love my brother. I'm going to protect him. He's going to become my little mascot. I'm going to defend him, you know, to the hilt in the school, on the playing grounds. Reaction formation, that's called, for example. Intellectualization, rationalization, turning it into its opposite, identification with the aggressor, and so on and so on. There's a very boring book called The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense, which you can read. I won't list them anymore. The important thing is that you build up these defenses against the repressed, because the repressed is constantly threatening to return. Those defenses, those shaping of your character, is just that. It's the origin of character difficulties or character traits, a very important part of our personalities. How we shape our ego, distort our ego, in order to help it to keep those things battened down, the repressed. That's the meaning of the word defense. This is repression. It's not a defense in the same level of conceptualization as all the other mechanisms of defense. They are what Freud calls after pressure in his paper on repression. It's primary repression, and then there's after pressure, keeping it down there. So now, what do you do if you're a repressed desire or a repressed impulse? Do you say, okay, I'm giving up? No ways. Because you come from here, from these guys. These guys never give up. God himself ordained these guys. They're much more powerful than you. They are your biological living substance. You are compelled. You are compelled to go forth and multiply. You know, you need to. You want to. It's nice. You're never going to tell yourself, I'm going to stop wanting. And there are always going to be things that you just cannot tolerate, that you are going to annihilate. You know, one way or another, there's things that are going to get to you that you are going to hate. You know, and those hatreds, once you've got them, you all know, they fester. You know, they're there. The resentments burning beneath the threshold of awareness stay there. And they're constantly trying to get out. That's why you have to have these character defenses to keep them down. But because down here, things work omnipotently, because it's not realistic, this psychotic world, you can make anything you like into anything you like by mechanisms that Freud called the primary process. Displacements, condensations, symbolizations. You just transfer the impulse from one object onto another one and say, okay, I'll have it there instead. It's better than nothing from the point of view of the psychotic id, the omnipotent id, that brooks no frustration ever. So it's constantly trying to come back at you. If you're lucky, your defenses hold. And that's your character. That's what makes you into the character that you are. It builds character, young man. Or it might pop out. And it won't pop out in the place where you originally popped it down. It will pop out somewhere else where you don't expect it, where you least expect it, in the most absurd, irrational places. That is transference neurosis. It's transferred and it has popped through, so it's neurotic. It's come back at you. The repression has failed. It's the return of the repressed. What do you do then when the thing has come back at you, popped back in? Do you say, okay, bloody hell, let it stay? No, not at all. You carry on trying to. Now it's panic stations. That's like the Titanic has hit the iceberg. It's pouring in. What are you going to do? Close the bullet, let it in there, but close here, That's what you do. So the repressed has returned, and you have desperate measures to keep on battening it down. So you've still got a conflict. The repressed popped up in a transferred place, and you're still trying to keep it down. That is called a compromise formation. The symptom is that thing. The symptom is the repressed that's popped out, and your attempt to batten it down as a last desperate measure. They frequently are absurd, these symptoms. They certainly are most unwelcome by the rest of the ego. And so what do? You phone Trevor Lubber and you say, I believe you offer analysis. Okay, so there your neurotic patient comes along with his or her symptom in tow, seeking help. So neurotic transference neurosis, neurotic functioning is at that level, level 1. The second, and that's called, and the mechanism of it is repression that fails. The return of the repressed transferred. That's why it's called transference neurosis. That's the first thing that can go wrong. But in this, the ego, the mature ego, the reality ego, is still in charge. Another thing that you can do is you can withdraw from the reality ego. You can say, this is too difficult for me. This level of functioning I can't cope with. I'm going down to another level of functioning. I'm regressing. To narcissism. This is much more difficult. It's a much more difficult balancing act. So I regress to narcissism. Very important to recognize is that some people never get that far in the first place. So you don't only get regressions to narcissism, you get fixations at narcissism. But when it's a regression to narcissism, it's called secondary narcissism in Freud. When you never got beyond it, it's primary narcissism. Or that part of you that never got beyond it. And it also can be only a part of you that regresses to it. But to the extent that that is in charge, to that extent you have a narcissistic disorder. which means that you are splitting. I mean, not a narcissistic disorder, I beg your pardon, a narcissistic organization. It's not yet a disorder. A narcissistic organization where you split and project and introject. Function according to your emotions rather than according to reality. You function according to your wants rather than your accepting how it is. And that necessarily means that you start to make things all good and try to be those things in projection, and you make things all bad because you've split, because it's much easier than all this complicated business of trying to deal with all the ambivalences and ambiguities and complexities. And the bad things you project. The problem with narcissistic organizations is that this bad object that you're trying to project is stuck to you. You can't actually really project it. So Freud says in neurosis, there's a rent between the ego and the id. That's repression. In the case of narcissism, there's a rent between the ego and the superego. But it's now a primitive ego, a narcissistic ego, an idealized ego, a narcissistic me, a perfect me, which is therefore a self-object me, a taking in of everything about the world that's good, making it back into yourself, and conversely, trying to project everything that's bad, a primitive superego. But you can't really project everything that's bad. So there's a rent between the ego and the superego, but it's a narcissistic ego and its primitive superego. That's where the rent is. That's where the breakdown occurs. It's because the bad won't stay in the object, and the good in the object stays in the object. So the splitting fails. The attempt to get rid of the bad object fails. These patients are troubled by very severe superegos, primitive superegos, when they're inside of them. Small wonder that they're trying to get them outside of them. Small wonder that they're paranoid. Paranoia is one of the prototypes in Freud of a narcissistic pathology. Another one is melancholia. Melancholia is when the primitive superego won't go out, stays inside of you. It is a powerfully destructive force by one part of you directed against another part of you. That's melancholia. Self-hatred. Something that's hated as much as the worst object in the outside world, but it's actually inside of you. And it's extreme hatred. It's not dislike. It's not ambivalent. It's blindly murderous hatred. It's deathly. It is excruciatingly unbearable, melancholia. Now, because the term narcissism has acquired other meanings in our contemporary taxonomies, we speak of narcissistic personality disorders, and we speak of borderline personality disorders as if these are two different things. Let me quickly say here that this is an inherently unstable organization. The introjective projective attempts in relation to these self-objects, these artificially extrematized good and bad objects. Because the world doesn't really work that way. Because things are not really absolutely good or absolutely bad, and less still do those absolutely good things coincide with your beloved self, and all the absolutely bad things coincide with the hated external reality. It's an inherently unstable organization. And just as so is a repression, always threatening to come back. And when it does, you have a neurotic symptom. So too in a narcissistic organization, the bad object is always threatening to come back, and you're constantly having to deal with this very precarious balance. And borderline disorders are a result of that precariousness, that inherent instability. Because in here you're dealing with two different parts of yourself. It's a more profound instability than trying to keep a desire out. At least you know this is me, and that's, this other thing which is actually id, I'm putting back there. Whereas here, it's a confusion between yourself and the object. It's fundamental to what splitting, projection, and introjection are, a confusion between self and object. So you're constantly banging into the object and banging into parts of yourself that you thought were objects, and it's a mess. And you're constantly trying to desperately get it back into the split, which is never going to work. That's a borderline disorder. In the sense of the DSM-4, a borderline personality disorder. There's another meaning of the word borderline, which is on the borders of psychosis, to which I now move. If you're functioning at that level, you're narcissistic. I must say before I go down to level 3, I've said that if your repressions are successful, then you're not neurotic. You're limited in some way, restricted in some way. You're a repressive type, but doesn't mean you're neurotic. You don't have symptoms. You're getting by, one way or another. If this level of organization is successful, you are perverted. And in many forms of addiction, the same thing happens. What that means is you've managed to distort your ego, just as you do in character, the formation of character defenses. Now you have what we call character pathology, where you've distorted the thing, like in splitting, in such a way that it works. It's a contradiction, two mutually incompatible truths, and you hold them both to be true. You have your cake, and you eat it too, like a psychopath or a pedophile. And who suffers? Not you. You're fine, because you've construed it, in Freud's wonderful word, artfully. You've artfully construed things so that it can be black when it looks black, and it can be white when it looks white, and it can be the same thing, which is not possible. But you've artfully construed it so that it is possible. You do have control over the object, really, successfully. You've made the object into what you want it to be, and you've convinced yourself it is like that, and you've got the object to fit in with you. Who suffers? Not you, the object. Society, in the case of psychopathy. Children, in the case of pedophilia. Your body, in the case of addictions. But you've managed to convince yourself that's not you, or it's not true. And although somewhere else you know it's true, somewhere else you know it's not true. It doesn't apply to me. Those are successful narcissistic disorders, or successful narcissistic organizations, and they very seldom come to us because they're not suffering. They're frequently sent to us. And it's not just a matter of, like in England, when you're sentenced to psychoanalysis at the Portman Clinic because you're a paedophile. When I say sometimes they're made to come to you, it can be much subtler forms of it. Like your spouse says she'll only stay with you if you go to therapy. Okay, so that's another artful thing I can do. I can go to therapy, haha. That works. That doesn't mean you're in therapy, like the patient who's suffering and can't cope and asks for your help. I'm only going to keep on giving you your pocket money if you go to therapy. Stop buying dacha. Okay. Now we come down to psychosis. Yeah.
Is the split always successfully maintained? Or does the split...
In perversions. No, let me make this clear, because I think maybe I didn't make it clear. I'm distinguishing, here I've spoken about repressions, which work, with character defenses, which limit you, but which work. So, there you become an accountant, and you're fine. I'm making a joke. You become a nun, or something. You become a philosopher, intellectualize all of it, till you're blue in the face, and you're fine. Everyone else is sort of like, oh, but you're fine. The neurosis occurs when the repressed returns, and you can't keep it down. Now, likewise, there's a distinction here to be drawn between narcissistic organizations, which are stable and successful, and narcissistic disorders, narcissistic neuroses, as Freud called them, which are unstable, they're not working. The fundamental problem, the fundamental instability is that you can't make the bad stay in the object and the good stay in you. The bad keeps on threatening to come back. So you have paranoia, or it's back, melancholia, or it's switch, borderline disorder. But if you manage to construe the split artfully, in other words, make character alterations, where you shift things. You know them, but you don't know them. You're prepared to break through, to twist and distort the rules, as perverts do, as many addicts do, as psychopaths and other sociopaths do. Then it works. So that's not a narcissistic neurosis in the sense that the patient is suffering and comes to you for analysis. It's a narcissistic organization. It's what Freud conceptualized under the heading of character disorders. It's a very broad category, which means that you have manipulated the structure of your mind in a way that's not really truthful, that fudges things. But you allow yourself to get away with it. It's slippery.
I'm just surprised that it can actually be sustained. What about the world and what about other people?
The other people suffer. The other people suffer like hell. There's a man in Austria, put his daughter downstairs. What a wonderful object to have, completely and utterly under your control. Do you feel guilty and bad? Not a sausage. Did he come for analysis? No. He got caught. They can sustain it for a lifetime. And that's the one that got caught. We don't know how many others there are in Austria that haven't been caught yet. But I don't want to create the impression that it never happens that you have a suffering pervert. To that extent, they are now suffering from a narcissistic disorder, and there you can analyze them. But there's many more. The way to make your narcissistic organization work is to do it in those ways. That's why those disorders tend to be fairly stable and don't come to us for treatment, and the object suffers. The ones that are unstable are not perversions and severe addictions and psychopathies. And to that extent, they're therefore called something else, and those are the ones who do come to us. But they come to us with a very particular aim in mind, which I'll come to. You much rather want these guys coming to you, because they say, "Doctor, I've got a problem, will you help me?" This one says, "I'm going to use you to make my situation better," because that's the way that they function, but that's what we're coming to. Now, the last disorder is psychosis. I mentioned psychosis for two reasons, but first I must tell you sort of the opposite. I know it's not common for you to see psychotic patients in your private practices, so I'm not going to spend as much time on it. But you sometimes do, so for that reason we do need to spend some time on it. And psychoses are sometimes encapsulated. They can emerge in a treatment, or it can be just a part of the patient's functioning. And you then need to know what you're dealing with. So I'm telling you about it for that reason. But most of all, I'm telling you about it in order for you to see what it's not. Because so many things are called psychotic mechanisms in our literature these days, and it's just a complete misnomer. It causes real confusion. Many of these things are called psychotic mechanisms, and they simply are narcissistic mechanisms and should therefore be called that. So I'm also wanting to make clear, as I said, what is not a psychosis by telling you what a psychosis is. A psychosis, just like a neurosis and a narcissistic disorder, functions in two stages. It's an attempt to cope with something that the patient, that the ego, the self, the me can't bear, and then it doesn't work. So the thing it can't bear needs to be dealt with all over again. This is called disavowal. The first mechanism, the first step. What is meant by disavowal? Whereas in a neurosis, the ego withdraws itself from a piece of its own organization and pushes it down into the id. That's called repression. In a disavowal, what the patient does is the very opposite. In his or her, in the ego's task of trying to balance, remember that's what it's all about, balance its needs and wants with the fact that the things it needs and wants are out there and difficult to get. That's mental work. That's the ego's job. That's what the ego's there for. In a neurosis, the ego sacrifices the drives, pushes them down in a repression. In a psychosis, the first step is it does the opposite. It sacrifices reality. It withdraws itself from reality. Now, in a manner of speaking, and it's not just a manner of speaking, a narcissistic organization is halfway toward a psychosis because it's the same thing halfway. You're not denying reality completely. You're not disavowing reality completely, obliterating your knowledge of it. What you're doing is turning it into a reality which is more in line with your emotional needs. But nevertheless, it's still a reality. You live in the world of internal objects down here, rather than whole objects, real objects up here. So, but in psychosis it goes that one step further. And Freud says this very clearly, and I don't know how many people have understood this, but when you work with psychosis, you see it. Guri is a psychiatrist. He knows what I'm talking about. I know some of you have psychotic patients. I know Marianne, I sent you one. So, some of you I know have seen it. And I'm going to illustrate it for you just now. But it is a profound process. The first thing is the patient withdraws from reality. On the outside, it looks like that, just that. They're withdrawing from reality. They are withdrawing. They're becoming withdrawn. They become passive, or they become kind of inert. They become kind of absent. They're not there. This is called the negative symptoms of a psychosis once it's declared itself. But frequently they don't call attention to themselves. It's not noisy. Patients just withered away. They have profound disabilities, these patients, but they're not psychotic. And I'm not talking about DSM-4, in the psychodynamic sense of the word, the psychotic symptoms haven't appeared. The psychotic symptoms are, in the DSM-4 sense of the word, the positive symptoms. That's the noise, that's the trouble. Once you withdraw, destructuralize your entire ego, if it's a total psychotic organization, you have completely obliterated everything that you know about the world and every means you have for knowing about the world. You have destroyed your mind. Your mind becomes the outside world to you. Then what happens is now you're functioning at this level, at the psychotic level. And what happens then is, as Freud said, the id creates a delusion. It applies a delusion like a patch over the rent between itself and reality. So it replaces the piece of ego, and it can be just a piece. In fact, more often than not is just a piece. That's why you can get encapsulated psychoses, or more commonly you get psychotic, more or less big psychotic symptoms, but there's still a part of the patient who's in touch with reality. It's very important for our technique. But the part that's missing, because the drives still need the objects, and because you're now functioning at the level of an omnipotent organization, you create new ones. Those are the hallucinations and the delusions. Those are the symptoms of a psychosis. It's the conflict between drive and reality coming back again, because now you've created a new reality, and the problem is it's not real. That's why all of this ego maturation had to occur in the first place, because it doesn't work. It's profoundly dysfunctional, profoundly disabling, profoundly ill. Ill. These patients are very, very, very disabled and sick people. And they are pathetic, tragic cases where their delusions are constantly at absolute loggerheads with the world, which doesn't go away. As much as they said it's not there anymore, it's still there. And now they don't have the ego apparatus to deal with it because they've destroyed it. So the two last things I want to say before I finish this summary. We have over here relative health and neurosis and narcissism and psychosis and its depth of pathology. It's worse, more severe. The further you regress, the more you give up everything that you've developed to cope with life. You are more ill the more you go down the hill. And I want to put that into drive theory terms because it's an important part of what happens clinically with these patients. Down here, drives don't have to fit with each other. You can feel pure love, pure hate, absolute demand, doesn't care about reality, doesn't matter. These are biological processes. They're just there. You know, they don't have to make sense or be compatible or even be manageable. They're there. They're like the stars in the heavens are there. At this level, you're starting to try to bring them into conjunction with a representation of the world. It's a representation of the world that's very wonky, but it's a representation of the world, actually. It's internal objects. They're objects. They're not delusions. They're not magical, omnipotent creations. But they split. So the drives, although they're beginning to be brought into conjunction with reality, they're not brought into conjunction with each other. And for that reason, they don't work in reality. Because in reality, you have to bring them into conjunction with each other, because in reality, they both exist. And you can't have the one without the other in reality. So the problem of ambivalence, for example, I hate her, the bad mother. I love her, the ideal mother. They're the same person. Hello? Doesn't work. In psychosis, it's a part of reality that the patient can't cope with. Now, and the patient withdraws from reality, excludes reality from the equation. But because we can't exclude reality, it has to create a new reality, which is the symptom, which bangs into the actual reality with catastrophic consequences. Now, in reality, the ego is always struggling with all three of those things. And this is a fundamentally important point in terms of the question that prompted this whole seminar, which was, what do we do with cases who are mixed? In reality, we are all a mixture of all of those things, not in our pathology, but in our conflicts. We're all struggling with reality. We're all struggling with our drives, our wants and desires, and we're all struggling with parts of ourselves that we wish weren't there, and parts of the object that we wish were in ourselves, but aren't. It's where the rent occurs. It's what the ego decides to sacrifice that determines the structure of the pathology. You can't have an ego that simultaneously gives up on itself and sides with the id, and also institutes repressions. There's nothing there to do repressing. The repressed is the opposite, It has said, I'm giving up on repression big time. I'm going to become just the drives. That's psychosis. You can't have a mixture of a psychosis and a neurosis. The pathology is a psychosis. The big ticket item, to the extent that the ego has to make a choice, it produces one pathology or another. That's the big ticket item. The part that's left is still in conflict. The symptoms come from one direction or another. That's the illness. That's the psychopathology that you're struggling with. And then there's an ego that still has psychotic mechanisms neurotic mechanisms, narcissistic mechanisms, which is to a lesser extent are working, the part that's left. So it's not as if you're not going to find all of those things in the patient. But the task in taking your bearings in what you're dealing with is to make a decision, what has the ego decided to sacrifice? Or to put it in other words, what is the thing that this person couldn't cope with? The thing that I can here see this patient can't cope with. Is it something about reality that they couldn't cope with and therefore making as if it's not there? Is it something about their own wants and desires they can't cope with and they're making as if it's not there? Or is it something about themselves that they can't cope with, that they're making as if it's not there? Now, these are rules of thumb. I really, at this point, cross the line between simplification and oversimplification. They are rules of thumb. It's a little sort of phrase that you can hold in your mind to try and sort of begin to make sense of what you're dealing with. But in the interests of not oversimplifying too much, I'm now going to give you some case examples. Very brief little sketches. These are all patients that I personally have known. Not all of them have I treated. I'll tell you. 2 of them I haven't treated. I'll tell you about those when I get to them. Okay, one is a patient, and also you must know, since I left London and came back here, I don't see any ordinary psychoanalytical patients. I work in a hospital in a neurology ward. So that distorts somewhat my current clinical experience. But in London, I had an ordinary psychoanalytical practice with 5 times a week to once a week patients. So I've drawn from the full range of those patients, but obviously the police. Oh my God. It's coming back. Yeah. But because I've chosen from the full range of patients that I see, there's an overrepresentation of the kinds of cases that you guys probably don't see that much. Okay, first one, and I'm just trying to give you the absolute core formulation so that you see what I mean. This is the first example of a transference neurosis, a neurotic disorder. This patient came to me with a tic. It goes like this. That's his symptom. And he tells me that what makes him have the tic is whenever he feels sort of put upon. He's being forced to do something. He's being made to accept something that he doesn't want. So when he's at work, for example, and he has to deal with his boss, the tic comes a hell of a lot. It's very embarrassing. It's not something that he likes. It's ridiculous. It makes him look ridiculous. He feels ridiculous. He feels humiliated. So now you see the oversimplification of what I said about the rule of thumb. Because you might say, so this guy's got problems about, there's some part of himself that he can't cope with. But that's the symptom. No patient can cope with their symptom. It's not a part of themselves in this sense of the word. The patient doesn't experience it as a part of himself. He experiences it as this completely ridiculous thing that he has to do. Now, in really pure cases, really pure neurotic cases, that's a hallmark. That they experience the symptom as the horrible phrase is ego dystonic. It's something that they feel, is not me. It's abnormal. It's an overwhelming anxiety. It's a bad thing. It's like something it's panics. It's a need to wash my hands all the time, or it's a symptom. They experience it as a thing separate from themselves. It's coming as it happens from the id. It is separate from themselves. It's something they have separated from themselves and pushed down into the id. And your guiding light is that it's a want or a desire. Now, in the analysis of this patient, which I saw for a good few years, and I'm going to fast forward through the analysis because now I'm just wanting to tell you the structure of his pathology. The analysis of this symptom revealed that the underlying, the core repressed impulse was a wish to be alone with mum. He wanted to be alone in a blissful, orgiastically ecstatic union, absolutely exclusively with mum. And the feeling is he's being pulled away from her all the time. He's being forced away from her all the time, and he's shaking it off. I know it sounds ridiculously old-fashioned. I chose it because I know it sounds ridiculously old-fashioned, but it's true. It's real. This patient came to me for analysis. That was his tic. That was the underlying repressed impulse, and he doesn't have a tic anymore. It's gone. Now, is that the whole structure of his difficulties? No, of course not. And I'm just giving you the absolute core thing, but just in order to illustrate that that the disorder isn't just the core thing. Let me first of all make a second point about the theory. Freud said all of our repressions, our decisive repressions, except in traumatic neuroses, the decisive repressions happen in childhood, in early childhood. Because that's when the ego is feeble. That's when it can't cope with its wants and its desires. It's got no capacity to meet them in the outside world. So it has to give up on them. Repressions are rife in earliest childhood. He then says other things that happen later on in life, which threaten to bring back the repressed, get secondarily repressed. They get pulled down by the repressed, was the way he put it. So anything that's too closely associated with the repressed gets also repressed, only because of the association with the first repression. Now that's a general principle, which again, it gives me no pleasure to sound like a 100-year-old theorist, really, believe me. I only tell you these things because I've seen them with my own eyes, and I've cured patients like this, and I even dare to use the word. This patient's symptom disappeared. And as it happens, I know I followed him up years later because as a result of his analysis, partly, he was able to marry and have a child. And the child was, nature working as it does, completely indifferent to us, was very impaired, very disabled. And he came back to me with his very disabled child, and I was able to speak to him about how things had gone for him many years later. And his tic never came back. And it didn't come back because we analyzed it like this. This is what it was all about. Now, that was much more complex than that. The repressed fantasy, and that's what it is. It's a repressed fantasy now transferred. Whenever anybody tries to get him to do something that he doesn't want to do, it evokes this scenario. Father is trying to take me away from mother. What happened was also this symptom makes him look ridiculous. So remember what I said, that there's a compromise formation in every neurotic symptom. Here's partly, it's like, piss off, shrugging you off. But at the same time, it reduces himself as a desirable, or what's the word, not so much desirable as proud man. He looks like an idiot. A tic, it makes you look ridiculous. You're constantly humiliating yourself. And in his analysis, that was very important. And by the way, it went the other way around, the analysis. Of course, we didn't start with an understanding of the tic. We ended with an understanding of the tic. One layer above that was an understanding through the analysis that he felt inferior. And that the tic made him feel more inferior. He felt inferior to these men, these bosses and these colleagues and other men in the transference, me, who at that stage of the analysis he decided was South African. And in his mind, South Africans, colonials, are more macho, they're more male than Europeans. Sorry, Gary, but that was this patient's view. Earlier on in his analysis, he thought that I was Dutch. It changed. But at that stage, I just want to make clear that how the structure of the neurotic thing isn't just, so here's the repressed fantasy, and that's the whole patient's personality. Above that, there was this layer of him castrating himself. And then there was a whole other excrescence of this patient's disorder, which had a repressed homosexual desire in relation to his father, which was then the secondary repression. This thing then got pulled down. It was, first of all, the one side of the symptom was shrugging father off, shaking him off, refusing him, defying him. And it was in those situations that the symptom came out, but in a way that makes himself give up, makes himself look the fool. And in the fantasy and in unconscious, fantasies proliferate, because now it's underneath, it's unconscious. In his unconscious fantasy, now he was like the mother, he was like a girl, and that was his second chance. So now, if he can't have mother, well, he'll have father, he'll be like father, was the first one, okay, giving up on that, okay, I'll be like mother. And that was another layer of his analysis, and it was a very big repressed fantasy, that. And it was a big part of the analysis, big part of his transference to me, was that I was trying to dominate him in the way that had a homosexual panic attached to it, initially. That was a layer that we had to get through. Just because I say I'm aware of how old-fashioned are the things I'm telling you, I want to tell you one other thing about this patient. And these sorts of experiences really impacted on me. I'm a truth-loving person. It really made a huge impression on me. This patient, in the context of analyzing this whole constellation, he had the experience of his penis inverting and going into his body. He felt it, and he said, and when I made accurate interpretations, when I made interpretations that started to touch on this repressed material, he would say, stop hitting on me, stop hitting on me. He experienced it as blows, that I was hitting him. And he felt his penis retracting and inverting, felt it. He's not a psychoanalytic student. He's an Argentinian bookkeeper, in fact, was what this guy was. I know that you think everybody in Argentina is in analysis, but this guy was living in England, and he was completely uneducated in analysis. And I'm realizing I've hoisted myself by my own petard, because I'm trying to disguise it a bit. So it makes it sound like he's more likely to have known about it. He knew nothing about it. He admired me because I was a scientist, he said. He liked the way that I was. He came to me because I was a scientist. He'd done research. And I'm a proper man. I'm not one of these womanly psychoanalysts and so on. That's why he came to me. He wasn't about to want to create a symptom, in order to gratify me that Freud was right. There's an absolutely vivid fantasy of castration touched on by going into this material, and absolutely remarkable disappearance of the symptom with an analysis of the repressed. But I also want to point out, here's a patient who has bodily feelings, imagining, that his penis is inverting. Is that a psychotic mechanism? Well, it's like one, but by no means, by no wild lengths of the imagination can you describe this man as psychotic. He's lying there saying, Dr. Solms, I feel as if this is happening. Not it is happening. It's a very different thing. But I'm making the point there that it's a very complicated, nuanced picture. I'm trying to and I'm giving you just the smallest little vignette, the smallest little, not vignette, little construction about this patient. But I hope you can see what I mean by a neurotic structure. There's a repressed fantasy from earliest childhood. He's in conflict. The conflict is about, do I want this? Do I want that? I know what, I can't cope with that. It's gone. And then he finds himself in the same scenario throughout life. From the age of 5, his tic came. And he finds himself throughout life in the same situation wherever he's wanting something and a male figure is forcing him to not have it and rather do his homework or do whatever, and he develops this tic. The tic is the return of the repressed. That's what it was in this patient. And it had everything to do with his Oedipal constellation, with castration anxieties, all of the classical stuff. And it was removed by analysis. And we'll come back later to the technical elements of what such an analysis involves.